Welcome everyone to Mitchell Cairns-Spicer's presentation. This is his final Milestone 4 final presentation of his Master of Architecture thesis. The title of the thesis, Beyond Building, Designing Sustainability for Humans. Emiliana Horvat is Mitchell's supervisor, Mark Gorgolewski the second reader. We have Marco Polo with us, the Associate Chair of Graduate of the M.Arch program in our department. And we have two guest critics, Paul Dossett. He is the Principal Architect at Sustainable and an instructor at Ryerson's Department of Architectural Science. Paul is a leading thinker and advocate in the space of sustainability and architecture. For the past decade, Paul has been central to the introduction of sustainable architecture to the mainstream while practicing deep community engagement with equity-seeking groups of all backgrounds and abilities. At the core of Paul's philosophy and practice is the belief that design and construction solutions should be simple, sensitive, and sustainable. And there were three other words, these starting with P, that they should always consider people, planet, and prosperity. Vincent Getz is an associate at Diamond Schmidt. He's been there for, I think, almost 20 years now, Vincent, and has contributed his skills and expertise to a wide range of public and private projects. Vincent holds degrees from the University of British Columbia, and he is an alumnus of Ryerson University Department of Architectural Science. He's a certified passive house designer and lead accredited professional. Vincent regularly participates in mentoring activities, and we've seen him around the school every so often, and enjoys continually learning and sharing knowledge about sustainable design, as well as innovative building technology. So there is our panel, including our guests. Thank you very much, Paul and Vincent, for agreeing to join us. Now, Mitchell, you know the routine by now. 20 minutes for your presentation, following a brief time for our guests in particular to ask any questions that they might have for clarifications, and then you will receive feedback from the jury following that. Are you ready to start?
Yes, I'll let you know in advance. I know I go a minute or two over, but it depends on my speed.
Okay, so. You know, don't rush. Okay. Yeah. All right. So Mitchell, please.
Okay. Well, thank you for introducing the title, Yuri. I'll begin with part one, sustainability and architecture. In the past few decades, sustainable thinking has come to the forefront of many disciplines, and in particular, architecture. In 2020, sustainability and architecture are no strangers. Glancing through the pages of various architectural magazines and websites, one could even say that we've reached a saturation point of sustainable design. As a field of study and practice, architecture encompasses many aspects of building design. However, only some of them are being used to drive sustainability. Put simply, most of today's sustainable design relies on technological aspects of architecture, which removes the burden to behave in a sustainable manner from a building's occupants. Current sustainable design strategies make up for irresponsible human behavior. They mitigate the outcome of behavioral problems. This thesis asks if aspects of architecture beyond the technological can be used to better engage people in sustainable thinking and behaviors. We tend to conflate the term sustainability with carbon emissions and the greenhouse gas effect, but sustainability is much broader than that. I'd like to make a distinction between resources that we produce for consumption, such as electricity, and those which we directly consume. Electricity is becoming more and more reliant upon renewable resources, and as this improves, the quantity of electricity consumption will have a minimal effect on a building's overall environmental footprint. Most other resources, however, don't work like this. Between deforestation, the intense growing operations, and cattle grazing, the Amazon will one day no longer offer fertile land. This is an example of practices that can be defined as unsustainable, as the replenishment rate of the resources cannot keep up with the rate of consumption. Regardless of the perceived abundance or quality of water, it too is a resource which, managed incorrectly, will become more and more scarce and contaminated in the coming years. Despite water being a renewable resource, mismanagement of water supplies, overpumped groundwater sources, depleted river flows, salinization, and chemical contamination can lead to water scarcity. Human demand of this resource, even in water-rich North America, can leave whole ecosystems with insufficient water, devastating plant and animal life. With all of this and water's unique tangibility and tactility in comparison to electricity, it will be the resource of focus for this thesis moving forward. According to the CMHC, on average, an individual Canadian consumes 6,879 liters of water per month. If the building were to collect and provide its water instead of relying on municipal water, it would greatly lessen the environmental impact of the water consumption. How much water can realistically be collected by a home, though? This diagram depicts a typical size suburban home with a building footprint of 10 square meters. The charts on the right indicate how much water is collected by a roof of this size each month relative to the amount of water used by various fixtures. As you can see, the collected water is only enough for a single fixture each month, with some water left over in months of heavy rainfall. This diagram demonstrates conceptually the immense scale of a catchment surface required for two different household sizes relative to a reasonably sized living space. The catchment surface of a dwelling for one individual would just fit on a typical Toronto suburb lot of 15 by 35 meters, and the catchment surface for a dwelling of a family of 4 would far exceed the boundaries of such a lot. This brings up the question of reasonable consumption. Instead of accommodating current consumption habits, are these habits even reasonable, and is it feasible for people to consume less water? Now that the problem has been defined, and before attempting to answer that question, let's look at how buildings currently deal with issues of sustainability. In my thesis, I've defined two main existing approaches to sustainable design. The first I call performance sustainability, which is a building that uses minimal resources through technological intervention. In terms of sustainable design, these types of buildings are generally unremarkable as their sustainable functionality is performed by systems often hidden from view or entirely disconnected from the overall design. Design sustainability, on the other hand, is a building that embeds sustainable ideologies into its architectural design process. These buildings are more overt in their sustainability since this would have been a goal from the outset of the design process. Part 2, Sustainability in Humans. While passive design strategies and high-efficiency HVAC systems are effective strategies of reducing the environmental impact of buildings, the humans occupying those buildings often don't understand or care about these systems, and therefore don't understand or care about their role in contributing to the building's overall sustainability. How then can architecture take the concept of sustainability, which often resides in a more technical realm, and bring it to the forefront of people's awareness? Sustainable design PhD student Deborah Lilly examined various methods that innovative products use to shape human behavior towards sustainable outcomes through their design. She created a simple framework which places products on a scale where one end is more passive and guides change, while the other is more aggressive and forces or ensures change. Her paper explored three concepts. The first, called feedback, found in industrial design products such as the power aware cord, which visualizes energy consumption. The second, called behavior steering, is evidenced through the flower lamp, which provides incentive to use less energy and closes as more energy is used throughout the day. And finally is technological intervention, exemplified by the integrated sink plus toilet, which acts on the user's behalf regardless of their desire. Using a washroom as a means to explore these ideas in a more architectural context, I developed a series of vignettes which attempt to consider how behavior might be shaped in this space towards the outcome of reduced water consumption. Through various modifications of this simple space, such as rendering it both physically and visually uncomfortable, visualizing wastewater and requiring the occupant to pump their own water, it became clear that adapting Lilly's work to an architectural context was not enough on its own. In a practical sense, an uncomfortable space is unrealistic. However, the one element that appears consistently throughout the rest of this thesis is the idea of feedback, visualizing consumption and waste volume. Where the previous approach began from a psychology perspective, a second stage of design research explored existing architectural theory and considered how it might be applied in the context of this thesis. In his book, Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality, Julio Bermudez presents the term extraordinary architecture experience, which is an encounter with a building or place that fundamentally alters one's normal state of being. By fundamental alteration, it is meant a powerful and lasting shift in one's physical, perceptual, emotional, intellectual, and/or spiritual appreciation of architecture. This text inspired a pavilion design which engages people in the most common aspects of household water consumption, though it does so in very unconventional ways. The anti-program of the pavilion allowed the design to explore beyond the confines of realism, pushing humans to an uncomfortable extreme. The main problem that the pavilion encounters is that one person would likely have a different experience and response to the building from another. Though the pavilion did not result in useful design elements, it ultimately points towards the variety of reactions individuals have towards architecture and how this one factor positions Bermudez's work as an interesting way of measuring experience, but not a tool for creating it. Part 3, Sustainability and Aesthetics. I'll let this quote by Frank Lloyd Wright preface this part of the presentation. Even these buildings we live in or for are no longer thought-built. In fact, they never were. They were merely taste-built. Aesthetics can be defined as a set of principles underlying and guiding the work of a particular artist or artistic movement. Consider guides for design such as the Golden Ratio or even Corbusier's Modular Man. These guides are used to arrive at a formally aesthetic, pleasing design outcome. This is obviously a very valid approach to design and plays a significant role in the architectural discourse. However, it is a dangerous temptation in the context of sustainable design. Over the course of several design projects, I struggled to escape the process of designing from this perspective. It is important to briefly reflect on some of the work to understand the need to detach from such an approach to design. The premise of the design for a consumption feedback neighborhood was to integrate publicly exposed water collection tanks into a home's design in an effort to reduce water consumption. The problem was baked into the project from the outset, as the driver for each design was not the water itself, but rather some external arbitrary aesthetic goal. In retrospect, these houses were designed with an aesthetic outcome determined prior to the design process. All of this is not to say every aspect of this project was flawed. In fact, many of the ideas developed in these houses persist into the latest design work. However, the most important lesson learned was how to escape the temptation of designing using aesthetics as the driver. Aesthetics as an outcome. The conclusion that can be drawn from the previous design explorations and much of the existing catalog of sustainable architecture is that to arrive at the stated goals of this thesis, aesthetics should not be a starting point. Instead, it should be seen as an outcome of a sustainable design process that forgoes formal aesthetic considerations to the greatest extent possible. In the book Aesthetics of Sustainable Architecture, author Glenn Hill describes a term called moral aesthetics, which defines a process of design whereby formal outcomes are dictated by sustainable considerations rather than aesthetic goals or principles. For example, both of these buildings feature an overhang. However, the left overhang was designed with a desired formal outcome in mind, whereas the right overhang exists to provide a greater surface area for rainwater collection and to reduce solar gains within the building. The driver for this overhang is not a desired formal aesthetic, but rather considerations for a more sustainable building. So I return to this image, which now takes on new meaning. The house was designed to be highly sustainable, in fact, designed to be net zero. However, the architecture does nothing to suggest this. Without prior knowledge, it would be reasonable to assume that the solar panels were newly installed on a house built decades ago. As such, the architecture is unable to promote new ways of thinking about resources. So far, this thesis has identified the problem related to sustainable design and water to be that humans generally consume too much of it within their home, and the architecture does nothing to guide or improve this behavior. It simply manages and mitigates. A second problem that the design of buildings themselves don't convey is the importance of caring for water. In fact, they can convey the opposite. Buildings are designed to have an exclusionary attitude towards water. Water in the context of humans generally relates to consumption, drinking, bathing, cooking, but buildings play a much more significant role when it comes to water. They keep people dry. At its absolute bare state, a building is simply a shelter, walls and the roof to keep water out, among other things. But in doing so, it paints water in a negative light, a thing to be avoided. To begin to address these issues through an architectural project, it was important to take a step back and approach the design process from the standpoint of water and how not only the occupant, but also the building are to engage with it. The first step was to create a consumption model based on practical yet highly conservative water use habits. As part one of this presentation demonstrated, a typical sized suburban home does not provide significant enough catchment area to meet the water needs of an individual, nevertheless a family of 4. It is impossible to subsist on collected rainwater alone unless there is a significant change to consumption patterns and behavior. This chart presents a detailed breakdown of such a change in consumption behavior. The graph extrapolates the consumption model to a family of 4 and determines the necessary catchment surface to collect this volume of water. After determining the required catchment area, it led to the development of this first exploration of a home located on a hillside in the Rosedale neighborhood of Toronto. The massing volumes are sized based on the required catchment surface area. The site includes a reed bed for water treatment and an evaporation pond, which will be further explained in the final design project. This vignette represents an early exploration into the implementation of using a trough-like cladding to collect wind-driven rainwater. The driver of this design was the idea that the function of an envelope can be changed such that it frames water in an entirely different way. This, again, will be explained further in the final design project. The key element of this design is a central large 7,800-liter tank that stores the monthly amount of water a family of 4 can drink under the ideal water consumption model. The placement of this tank is meant to act as a clear and constant reminder of the occupant's consumption habits. These various design strategies draw from much of the previous research and begin to demonstrate how a building can engage with water from a new perspective, as well as how the concept of consumption feedback can manifest in an architectural project. Though this project does not describe a new model for sustainable design, it provides a starting point for new avenues of conceptualizing aspects of design and highlights the areas that need greater focus moving forward. That brings us to the final design project. Moving on and learning from the previous residential exploration, this final design project was approached from a similar but more rigorous perspective. The previous design was located on a large site, which allowed for unlimited design exploration, whereas this project is located on a much more restrictive site. The smaller site changes the building's relationship with sustainability and water. With the previous design, the building was sized based on the consumption model for a set number of individuals. The site itself had very little bearing on how much water could be consumed, as it was so large. In the case of a smaller site, it plays a much larger role in what is considered to be a sustainable amount of water, as less surface area means less space for the various components of the water management system. Therefore, maximizing the extent of the site allows for a building that has a more concrete and clear relationship with sustainability. In other words, the previous design had an arbitrarily human-driven relationship with sustainability. This project has a site-driven relationship with it. Municipal water infrastructure serves the site. However, unlike the neighboring houses, this lot will not be connected to those services, as it will be a self-contained water system, performing all of the tasks from water collection to treatment on site. Where the first exploration began to look at integrating a larger water system, this design hones in on the detailed design of that system. Following the definition of sustainability that this thesis adheres to, the site itself must be able to sustain the water consumption process at all stages. The water system therefore begins with rainwater falling on a catchment surface, as well as on vertical surfaces to collect wind-driven rain. Storage tanks hold untreated rainwater, which will pass through a UV carbon filter on its way to the main consumption feedback tank. This tank is visible within the home and feeds directly to the fixtures. Gray water producing fixtures will drain into the gray water feedback tank, which feeds fixtures that can use gray water. Black water passes through a composting filter and into the reed bed. The reed bed acts as a natural water treatment plant, and treated water is drained into an evaporation pond. As mentioned previously, vertical surfaces can collect water as well. This is due to wind-driven rain, which is quite common during rainstorms. The amount of water deposited depends greatly on the wall's orientation. The driving rain rose indicates the amount of water per year that will be deposited onto a building face. This number is affected by several factors, such as surrounding urban density and wall height. Based on the orientation of the site, these diagrams illustrate the amount of water that will be deposited onto each wall. The leftmost diagram uses a wall that's orthogonal to the site, like any typical suburban house. Based on the site orientation, a fair amount of water will be deposited onto this wall. However, it can be further optimized. The wall on the right faces due west to maximize wind-driven rain exposure. It also accounts for a tree at the front of the lot by becoming more narrow, but extending upwards, which allows it to take advantage of more wind exposure at greater heights. Another iteration of the wall that was considered was a curved wall. Typically, concave surfaces introduce erratic wind patterns, which may or may not affect the amount of water impacting the wall surface. The equations used to calculate the wind-driven rain load on the previous walls cannot be used for curved walls, and as such, it will not be used moving forward. With the wall's position defined, it can be used as a starting point to generate a building massing. The other constraint on the building massing is the catchment area. Earlier in this chapter, it was concluded that at least 140 square meters of catchment area will be required to accommodate the water consumption model. Though, since sustainability in the context of this project is tied to the site, this number acts as a minimum rather than a limit. This diagram represents the massing process, which aimed to achieve a mass that accommodates both a minimum catchment surface as well as enough volume to provide a comfortable and expected living experience for a typical Toronto family. The roof is perhaps the element most synonymous with water protection. In the case of a house which operates on collected rainwater, however, it serves a far more important purpose than shelter. Rainfall data provides a quantity of rain passing through a horizontal plane. As already discussed, rain does not always fall in a perfect vertical line, as wind often adds a horizontal vector, causing it to fall at an incline. Abstractly, more rain will impact a surface incline towards the windward side, which matches the inclination of the falling rain. Yet the additional amount of rain may only be marginal, but it's worth addressing on principle alone. To summarize a rather convoluted process, wind speed can be used to estimate the incline angle of rain. This angle was used to determine the roof angles, which are perpendicular to the rain. On the left are various stages of massing development, which resulted in a sawtooth-style roof design. This is to reduce the overall height of the roof while maintaining the perpendicular angle towards the wind-driven rain. The selected building massing employs a simple flat roof assembly and affixes the angled catchment surfaces atop a properly enclosed roof system. This is preferable to the alternative of allowing the roof system to follow the sawtooth catchment angles. Overly complex roof geometry is more difficult to construct and therefore more likely to fail. A typical rain screen assembly is designed to engage with water, however, this engagement is defensive in nature. Instead, the profile of the cladding has been changed to resemble a gutter, providing a volume for water to collect and be transported into the home rather than away. A simple extruded rectangular profile is insufficient for this task, as it would deflect a significant portion of wind-driven rain, and so a more effective profile was designed. The main component of this profile is the angled face, which matches the most frequent incline of west wind-driven rain, maximizing the exposure of the vertical plane compared to the rectangular profile. Beyond the building itself, the site plays an important role in this design project. It is used to perform two necessary functions of completing the full cycle of water use: treatment and restitution. Following the use of water in a toilet or other fixture that produces black water, the waste travels into a composting filter before entering the reed bed. Here, the water is passed through several gravel and plant roots, which cause a variety of physical, chemical, and biological interactions before it eventually exits the bed and travels into the evaporation pond. Outside of direct human engagement, the site also has its own relationship with water. Typical grass lawns are not efficient at dealing with heavy rain loads, leading to significant runoff into municipal stormwater systems. To mitigate this, the site implements a rain garden, which is a depression into the site that's filled with various vegetation. The rain garden traps excess rainwater and slowly drains it back into the water table. With all of this previous work, it's important not to lose sight of the actual use of water within the home, related to humans. Where the previous designs only employed one tank, this one uses two, one for freshwater and one for gray water. The relationship between these tanks and the fixtures that use them is important to clarifying the stages of exergy or water quality. Water that can do the most work is in the main tank, and gray water, which can only do low quality work, is in the adjacent tank. This is further expressed by exposing the water traveling from the shower and sink into the gray water tank, clarifying this relationship. Two possible orientations for these tanks were explored. One was placing them vertically and the other horizontal. The issue with vertical placement is that it likewise suggests vertical placement of fixtures. It would be unreasonable to suggest that the occupant use the toilet on one level and have to walk up to the next to wash their hands. This leads to a horizontal placement, which allows for all of a washroom's fixtures to be situated on a single level, as well as allowing for multiple washrooms across both levels. To conclude, the primary question this thesis aimed to address was, how can architecture take the concept of sustainability, which often resides in a more technical realm, and bring it to the forefront of people's awareness? Approaching a sustainable building project from a typical architectural design perspective most often results in a disconnect between the sustainable design thinking and experience of the occupant. The alternative sustainable design process presented in this thesis steps outside of the conventional green design paradigm and begins to reframe the way architecture engages with surrounding natural systems, and likewise begins to reframe its occupants' understanding of the resources they interact with every day. Most importantly, this thesis identified that while many of the innovations and advancements within sustainable design are greatly contributing to a better future, they're not the only tools to address environmental concerns. Through careful and thoughtful design, architecture can step beyond its current role and begin to provide humans with the understanding required to make meaningful changes to their relationship with resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell. Paul, Vincent, the floor is yours. If you have any questions for Mitch regarding clarification of anything that he has presented.
I have one question. Did you make it? Did you generate enough water?
Oh, in terms of the catchment area and the size of the house?
Capture enough water, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I made, perhaps I didn't clarify that enough. So originally when I was, the first attempt at designing a house, which is this one here, that's when I generated this consumption model. So this on the left here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is that model. So basically, yeah, you can collect enough for someone to use and live somewhat comfortably. Obviously, you'd have to, there's a lot of changes you'd have to make in terms of how much water you use. You'd have to be a lot more cognizant of it. But it is entirely possible to have a average sized house using that catchment surface to collect that water. So to answer your question, yes.
I have a few more questions. Should I just start in on that? Or?
Sure, Vincent, yeah. These are questions, of course, for clarification.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think I'll just leave it at that then, and let Paul just ask questions about clarification, and then we can go into discussion after. Is that?
That's the idea. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Vince. Thanks, Mitchell. I actually don't really have any questions for clarifications. I thought that your framing of the solution was quite methodical and thorough. So I don't think I need any clarifications, but I do have a number of comments, but we'll wait for those.
I think we can potentially go ahead with the comments unless Miliana, Mark, do you have any questions before we ask our guests to provide feedback and commentary?
No, I'm good, thank you. We've been following Mitchell's work for the past year, so it's pretty clear to me. So yeah, we can start with the discussion.
Yeah, me too. I'm happy to go ahead.
Okay, so Paul, please take it away.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, Yuri. So Mitchell, as I said, I think that your framing of the solution was a very good step-by-step development through it. I got what the solution was all about. However, this is where the big however comes in. The feeling that I was left with when I got to the thesis was that your thesis was a solution searching for a problem. And I'll unpack that a bit for you because it sounds very blunt and direct. So one of the overriding current concepts of sustainability in the realm of architecture, how can architects help to drive people towards sustainability? One of the biggest things that we can do is reduce the consumption of cubic meters of built space per person, just the cubic meterage that each person occupies. And at the beginning of our discussion today, we were talking about the fact that I pay very expensive rent for an office that nobody has used since March, and nobody seems to want to use it either. So there's a consumption of cubic meters that we use that maybe we don't need to, and we can be more sustainable. So I got the sense that your project was certainly not in any way looking at the reduction of the cubic meters per person in your house. And that led me to a few other things that I thought were just being very willfully ignored. You use the City of Toronto, you use the rain data and the wind data, but you very expensively ignore the fact that our water system here in Toronto uses a mostly natural system, which is quite amazing in the world. The rain falls on the Oak Ridges Moraine. The Oak Ridges Moraine is one of the greatest natural water filters in the world. The rainwater is then collected and stored in Lake Ontario. When we need it, we draw it out and we run it through those ultraviolet and carbon filters in the R.C. Harris filtration plant. It's then used and metered, and it eventually goes back through the Ashbridges Bay treatment plant, which does all those things that the reed bed was doing. It goes back into Lake Ontario where it evaporates and rains again, and the cycle repeats. So there's a system that already exists, and the neighbors in the two houses are using it. So all of this led me to two questions, and the second question has two parts. I'll ask you both questions, and then you can answer them. So the first question is, utilizing that natural system that we have, if you were going to utilize that, how might you do the communication of the usage and the waste that you're trying to communicate to the building occupants without just using more cubic meters of building for the purpose, and all those other expensive systems? And that's the first question. The second question is, if this is not an ideal solution, what you've created is not an ideal solution for the City of Toronto, because we have such a robust natural system, mostly natural system available to us, where would this solution be a solution for? Where in the world? And would they have necessarily the same rain and wind principles? What might you need to modify to apply this solution in a location in the world for which it would be appropriate? So, two very long-winded questions. Sorry, Mitchell.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for the questions. So to answer your first one, I mean, I guess I kind of have a two-part answer. If you want to accept that that obviously our water system here is great, as you mentioned, and you don't want to consider using site-collected rainwater, which I'll get to in a second, you could completely forego that, I suppose, and use the internal feedback system of these exposed water tanks in a similar fashion. I actually did have some earlier projects that I haven't included here, but I did exactly that. Rainwater came in halfway through my thesis, and I was using municipal water and just looking at the human element operating inside of the building. But I guess I'll explain why I went so far as to completely cut out the municipal water connection. And the point for that was really just to push the concept of using architecture as a design medium to frame the importance of this particular resource. So I think if I go to this little sketch I did ages ago, and maybe imagine this in a larger context where you don't see the treatment happening at the plant. You don't see the treatment. You don't see all of these larger processes. And I think if that's located, if that's yours and you own it and you have to care for it, and it becomes something that you care about more. So I think in that way, aside from the sustainable considerations, just in terms of how it changes people's perception of resources and how they care about those resources, that's sort of the motivation for designing it the way I did. And to answer your second question, I established early on that I was going to focus primarily on Toronto and our region here, just because when you're dealing with things like meteorological data and these sorts of things, it's very difficult to create a universal design. And actually, I'd say that the final design outcome I have is certainly not universal, even relative to its neighbors. Like if you were to build this across the street, it would look entirely different. If you look at the rain data, obviously this catchment wall would be located at the back of your property if you're across the street, right? Certain things like that, the entire design would look different. So I think you could probably take the concepts and adapt them, to another site elsewhere in the world, but I think the principles would apply, but obviously the design outcomes would be entirely different. I'm not familiar enough with certain climates. Like obviously in a drier climate, that wouldn't work at all. You could certainly use the feedback systems that I developed for the interior and trying to express how this sort of the water quality and the difference between freshwater and gray water and appreciating it and that sort of thing. So I think ultimately this isn't a model that you replicate. Even like I said, even in the same neighborhood, you wouldn't replicate this everywhere. It's just the approach to the design that I intended to be something that could be used elsewhere. I hope that answers your questions.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thanks, Mitchell.
Vincent?
I'm interested as to why you chose a house as the model and not, say, for example, a suburban industrial building that has a huge roof and a low demand, potentially lower demand, and maybe not as doesn't have easy access to the infrastructure that you have in an urban setting.
Honestly, the primary driver for the house is just that it's an easy. It's something that people spend the majority of their time in. If you're trying to design something that engages people with, resource systems, something that's more personal to them, I think is certainly a better way to go. It's a location where, as an individual, you consume the majority of your resources. So I think those are the main reasons I approach the house.
The collection system for the roof, you had an interesting diagram where you had sort of a sawtooth structure versus the clip-on catchment. Yes. I was intrigued by the sawtooth and thought that maybe moves such as that could be seen as integral to the building. It could even be almost a structural solution to the building. So I'm interested. Yeah. It could also be the daylighting solution. It could be a whole number of things. So I'm interested as to why you went that route. And by going the route of the sort of clip-on, could you have maybe made more out of that? Could it have been PV panels that are also generating electricity, but also catching the water, but also providing shading, but also, that's my question.
Right. So actually, I'm just noticing this now because everyone's faces are covering it, but there's an issue with this slide. One of these two is supposed to show the clip-on, not the sawtooth style roof. But so the main and simple answer to why I did it was simply that, just from a construction standpoint and a practicality standpoint, I think it's more reasonable to use a flat roof, just in terms of, a roof obviously being a very complex structure, less potential for any faults in construction or down the road. And I think also it follows that philosophy I had of that moral aesthetics, where you don't need the actual roof itself to be a sawtooth. And I felt that in doing so, it's mostly out of a formal aesthetic decision that it looks better. Whereas this is the more practical and more sensible approach, I think. In terms of the PV panels and all of that, I did consider that, but and at first my thesis, I was trying to tackle too much. I was trying to do electricity and water and consumption of other resources, but I simply just focused on water. I'm not saying that this is the final, like this is how every building should be. You can certainly take this concept and incorporate other elements. So you could take the similar approach with feedback and use electricity for that. I think you could comment about every aspect of this design in that way. So if you were to take it a step further, certainly PV panels would be probably a wonderful use for the roof. Yeah.
And then just sort of last comment here, you mentioned about that, well, this is a solution for this site only, and across the street it would be different. But I mean, the slide you have up right now, and in many ways is almost it's almost the kit of parts that could be applied to a variety of types of buildings. So in some ways it is,
sure.
I think, could be a solution. I mean, you invented a cladding system to catch water, and you've got the roof system. But the plans, like if I look at the plans of the house, there's, I mean, it's, I mean, you could lay out however you want, really. Like
right.
The pieces here are really the roof, the cladding, and the storage, the visible storage, right?
Yes.
So in general, the layout doesn't really matter. You could quite simply not even have the bedrooms or the kitchen
sure.
or dining room, and it could just be a space that is, you populate it however you wish.
Yes.
And scale it up or scale it down however you wish.
Yeah. So there's sort of two parts to that, so I'll try to answer both. But the first thing is, when I said that it's not a solution to all sites, I just meant that the formal outcome of this particular building, you can take, like you said, you can take the sort of rule book that I created to design this and apply it to any other house in this neighborhood. I just meant that the actual outcome wouldn't look really at all similar to this in terms of the actual formal design, right? But yes, I totally agree that, and about the sort of auxiliary spaces like the bedrooms and living room. I addressed this in my thesis. I didn't have time to include it in the presentation, but that's sort of the one area that I realized you need to make a concession in terms of that idea of formal aesthetic design, because a living room can't be really driven by water as a resource, as it's not really a space that you engage with that in any sort of meaningful way. So those spaces are certainly auxiliary to the central component of this sort of main water fixture, tank, and the roof.
Okay. Marco, did you have any comments?
Nothing that hasn't already been talked about. We've been following the project for quite some time, so I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing today we have talked about at various stages. I think that Paul's point about isolating this question of sustainability to just the one element of water, I think obviously that was a strategy to focus the project, but the question is a much bigger one than that. The issue of Toronto's water system, I think, is an interesting one as well. This idea that it's in some ways a solution looking for a problem, but that's not really the driving ambition here, as I understand it. It's really more of a kind of speculative and experimental look at how we can make certain systems more legible and therefore potentially more influential on behavior. And I think in that sense, it's an effort in that direction for sure. But I think, yeah, I don't have anything much more to add to the discussion.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Marco. Miliana or Mark?
I have a couple of things just to say. I think one which Marco just touched on, which is this, the idea of the thesis is not about a whole bunch of water saving technologies. It's about how people will respond to the design of the building in a way that will save water. So I just wanted to, well, I suppose, could you talk a little bit about how you think people, well, separating different groups of people, because there are the people that are using the building, and then there are the people that may observe it from the outside. Are you addressing both the groups? I mean, I presume you're addressing those that are using the building because of all the different systems. But the people from outside, do you expect them to learn something from the building by observing it from outside? Will the neighbors learn something of the building without actually going into it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's something I struggled with throughout the process, is how do you know, what is the extent of architecture as a tool for communication, and perhaps even education? I mean, aside from putting up a big sign saying, this is how this works, I think that the point was to push it to the greatest extent possible in terms of what can this building do to represent an idea. So, and not just represent it, but actually enact it. So it's not just a representation. So, I think that the idea of having this cladding at the front of the house that's shaped like these gutters, something like that perhaps might make people question why it's like that. And again, it's just this idea of framing the design of the building to change the way that it frames its relationship with water. There's other things I didn't necessarily discuss at length. I did mention it in the document, but the way that the roof drains down the side, there's these metal chains embedded in these sort of steel housings that can rattle back and forth as the rain drips down. Things like that to kind of draw attention to how the house is operating. So just trying to use like a tool set to do that. I mean, it's one of those things where unless you actually build it and test it and ask what people think, it's really impossible to answer that question. But what I tried to do was express all of this functionality and make it, as Marco said, as legible as possible, compared to a typical sustainable design that might do these things, but it masks it.
So you were endeavoring to make these processes and these flows and these cycles explicit.
As explicit as I could within the context of this site and this program, yeah.
Yeah, and through that explicitity for people then to potentially become aware of what the implications are of their water usage, etc.
Yes, and just to answer Mark's question perhaps further, I think it would be great if other people walking by could somehow gain some sort of appreciation from it, but ultimately it's intended for the people who live there, and so that they can develop a greater appreciation of it. And it frames it as, this is my water, right? It's my, and I think feeling the ownership of something makes you more protective over it, rather than having it be, everyone's water. It's the city's water. It's going to come to me no matter what. Having it be the system that you see all the steps and perhaps even the fragility of it makes you a little more appreciative of it as a resource.
Okay, so I mean, we could have a long discussion about that, because
sure,
that answer worries me in some ways, in that you're framing the whole issue as in, I'm the king of my castle and I screw everybody else around me. And as long as I've got my water, it doesn't matter whether anybody else does. And I don't
sure.
need to worry about educating other people or engaging. It's sustainable. Can we deal with sustainability as a individual, sort my problems out, and I don't care about, let somebody else sort theirs? Or do we have to deal with it in a more community way? But I think that's a whole big discussion, which we probably shouldn't go down at this point in time. But I did want to touch on one other aspect of that. Mm-hmm. That is, or related to this answer and one or two of your other answers, is how much of what you've learned from doing this and the systems you've got in here and all the different aspects of this project would be useful, for instance, if the neighbor next door wanted to apply them, but they didn't want to build a new house. They wanted to apply them within an existing house. So how much of this would be useful in the existing building stock? Going back to Paul's point about just building more and building more volume, what about the existing volume, and how can we use some of these lessons? I know that wasn't your main focus, but your focus was on behavior, and there's a lot of people living in a lot of houses that could change their behavior.
Certainly. I mean, so in terms of volume, one of the main attempts with this, and the reason I didn't go smaller was, I think a lot of people aren't really willing to make concessions in terms of the way they live in every sort of way. So the attempt with this was to make a house that, affords you that same sort of space that you're used to, and same quality of life, but obviously you're using less water in this case. So because the house is the same size as its neighbors, if you perhaps redid your roof and in such a way that you could use it as a catchment surface, certainly you could use a lot of these features. I mean, in terms of integrating the tank on the interior, I mean, it would require probably a pretty significant renovation, but you could do something like that as well. But yeah, I mean, this house is designed to be, in terms of scale, it's very similar to its neighboring properties. So, and all the site features could certainly be integrated as well.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right, I think that we will have to wrap it up at that point. We need some time for deliberation.
So I don't have to say anything?
You could, Miliana, I thought you did not want to say anything.
Oh, no, I just didn't get a chance to say anything. No, it's fine. It's fine.
Please,
Yeah,
no, please go ahead.
No, I just want, I mean, as I said, I'm familiar with the project, and I don't have, it's more kind of a comment on this journey, and to kind of reflect on Paul's and Vincent's comments, and Mitchell's response also, that I think the beauty of this is, or at least that we're not going to have a solution that fits all sites, which that would lead towards a cookie cutter solutions, which are not very inspiring or also very good. I mean, but one of the things that Mitchell sort of worked here is developed a process and sets of parameters that potentially one can follow, and even if you are kind of designing the project at the opposite side of the street, by following the same process, we would come up to a different solution, which I think it's a beauty, right? Because it really allows for richness and different expressions in design, while achieving similar results. And you know what? Maybe following the similar, not only for the site across the street, but what happens if we are designing for Arizona or somewhere else. But yeah, that would be sort of my final comment. But a short question, but Mitchell, please don't, we are short with time. Now, when you went through the whole process, and I know it was frustrating at points, and kind of looking for a way to go and direction to take. Now, when when you look back, are there any things that you would do differently?
I mean, of course,
to be smart in the end, right? But
yeah, hindsight's 20/20. I think I'm glad I had those frustrations, because I don't think I would have gotten where I did with it. Making the missteps that I did with some of these earlier design, attempts, I think I developed a much richer concept at the end because of it. So yeah, honestly, I mean, if I redid it, obviously I'd do it entirely differently, but I think I'm glad I had that frustration, because it led to what to me is a stronger conclusion at the end.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Yuri. I think we have 15 minutes or so.
We will have to go. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paul and Vincent, and Mitchell. Thank you for the presentation and the discussion from everyone. Mitchell, I'll ask you to leave the meeting right now so that the panel can discuss and deliberate. And somewhere following our deliberations, I'm sure that Miliana will get a hold of you and provide you with.
Do you want me to leave, or do you want to put me in a waiting room?
How does it normally work? I think you leave, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, I think it's better to leave, because we'll have to start another meeting for the next presentation. And so if ours is running in the wait room, then we can't start the next one. So if you could leave, that would be better.
Yeah, Mitchell, don't go too far. I'll contact you to catch up for another one. Can somebody